God bless you. Today we're going to continue in the first book of Kings in the New Jerusalem Holy Bible, and we are in section 4, the two kingdoms until Elijah. Continuation of the reign of Jeroboam from the first, from 931 to 910. Chapter 14. At that time, Abijah, Jeroboam's son, fell sick, and Jeroboam said to his wife, "Come, please disguise yourself so that no one will recognize you as Jeroboam's wife, and go to Shiloh. The prophet Ahijah is there, the man who said I was to be king of this people. Go to him and take 10 loaves and some savory food and a jar of honey. He will tell you what will happen to the child." Jeroboam's wife did this. She set out, went to Shiloh, and came to Ahijah's house. Now Ahijah could not see, his eyes were fixed with age. But Yahweh had told him, "Jeroboam's wife is now on her way to ask you for a prophecy about her son as he is sick. You will tell her such and such. When she comes, she will pretend to be some other woman." So when Ahijah heard her footsteps at the door, he called, "Come in, wife of Jeroboam. Why pretend to be someone else? I have bad news for you. Go and tell Jeroboam, Yahweh, God of Israel, says this: I raised you from the people and made you leader of my house Israel. I tore the kingdom from the house of David and gave it to you. But you have not been like my servant David, who kept my commandments and followed me with all his heart, doing only what I regard as right. You have done more evil than all your predecessors. You have gone and made yourself other gods, idols of cast metal, provoking my anger, and you have turned your back on me. For this I shall bring disaster on the house of Jeroboam. I shall wipe out every man jack of the family of Jeroboam, fettered or free in Israel. I shall sweep away the house of Jeroboam as a man sweeps dung away till none is left. Those of Jeroboam's family who die in the city, the dogs will eat, and those who die in the open country, the birds of the air will eat. For Yahweh has spoken. Now get up and go home. At the moment your feet enter the town, the child will die. All Israel will mourn for him and bury him, and he alone of Jeroboam's family will have a proper burial. For in him alone, of the house of Jeroboam, can Yahweh, God of Israel, find anything good. Yahweh will set a king over Israel who will put an end to the house of Jeroboam. Yahweh will make Israel shake till it quivers like a reed in the water. He will uproot Israel from this prosperous land, which he gave to their ancestors, and scattered them beyond the river for provoking Yahweh to anger by making their sacred poles. He will abandon Israel for the sins which Jeroboam has committed and made Israel commit. Jeroboam's wife rose and left. She arrived at Tirzah, and when she crossed the threshold of the palace, the child was already dead. Then they buried him, and all Israel mourned for him, just as Yahweh had foretold through his servant Ahijah the prophet. The rest of the history of Jeroboam, what wars he waged, how he governed, this is recorded in the book of the Annals of the Kings of Israel. Jeroboam's reign lasted 22 years. Then he fell asleep with his ancestors. His son Nadab succeeded him. The reign of Rehoboam. In Jerusalem, Rehoboam, son of Solomon, became king. He was 41 years old when he came to the throne, and he reigned for 17 years in Jerusalem, the city which Yahweh had chosen out of all the tribes of Israel, to give his name a home there. His mother's name was Naamah, the Ammonite. He did what is displeasing to Yahweh, arousing his resentment more than his ancestors by all the sins which they had committed. They had built themselves high places, and had set up pillars and sacred poles on every high hill and under every spreading tree. There were even male sacred prostitutes in the country. He copied all the shameful practices of the nations whom Yahweh had dispossessed for the Israelites. And so it happened that in the 5th year of King Rehoboam, Shishak, king of Egypt, advanced on Jerusalem, and carried off all the treasures of the temple of Yahweh, and the treasures of the royal palace. He took everything away, including all the golden shields which Solomon had made. To replace those, King Rehoboam made bronze shields, entrusting them to the commanders of the guard who guarded the king's palace gate. Whenever the king went to the temple of Yahweh, the guards would carry them, returning them to the guard room afterwards. The rest of the history of Rehoboam, his entire career, is this not recorded in the book of the annals of the kings of Judah? Warfare between Rehoboam and Jeroboam went on throughout the period. When Rehoboam fell asleep with his ancestors, he was buried in the city of David. His son Abijam succeeded him. The reign of Abijam, in Jerusalem. He ruled 913 to 911. In the 18th year of King Jeroboam, son of Nebat, Abijam became king of Judah and reigned for 3 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Maacah, descendant of Absalom. In everything he followed the sinful example of his father before him. His heart was not wholly with Yahweh his God, as the heart of David his ancestor had been. However, for David's sake, Yahweh his God gave him a lamp in Jerusalem, with a son to succeed him, so keeping Jerusalem secure. For David had done what Yahweh regarded as right, and had never in all his life disobeyed whatever he commanded him, except in the matter of Uriah the Hittite. The rest of the history of Abijam, his entire career, is this not recorded in the book of the annals of the kings of Judah? Abijam and Jeroboam made war with each other. When Abijam fell asleep with his ancestors, he was buried in the city of David. His son Asa succeeded him. The reign of Asa in Judah, 911 to 870. In the 20th year of Jeroboam king of Israel, Asa became king of Judah, and reigned for 41 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Maacah, descendant of Absalom. Asa did what Yahweh regards as right, as his ancestor David had done. He drove the male prostitutes out of the country and got rid of all the idols which his ancestors had made. He even deprived his grandmother Maacah of the dignity of great lady for having made an obscenity for Asherah. Asa cut down her obscenity and burst it into the ravine of Kidron. Though the high places were not abolished, Asa's heart was loyal to Yahweh throughout his life. He he deposited his father's he dispossessed his father's and his own dedicated gifts of silver, gold, and sacred vessels in the temple of Yahweh. Asa and Baasha, king of Israel, were at war with each other throughout their reigns. Baasha, king of Israel, marched on Judah and fortified Ramah to blockade Asa, king of Judah. Asa then took all the remaining silver and gold left in the treasuries of the temple of Yahweh and the royal palace, entrusting this to his servants. King Asa sent them with the following message to Ben-Hadad, son of Tambrimon, son of Hezion, the king of Aram, who lived in Damascus. Let us make an alliance between myself and yourself, between my father and your father. Look, I have sent you a gift of silver and gold. Come, break off your alliance with Baasha, king of Israel, which will make him withdraw from me. Ben-Hadad listened favorably to King Asa and sent the generals of his armies to attack the towns of Israel. He ravaged Ijon, Dan, Abel, Beth-maachah, all Sinnoroth, and the whole territory of Naphtali. When Bashan heard this, he gave up fortifying Ramah and retired to Tirzah. King Asa then summoned all Judah. No one was exempt. They took away the stones and timber which Baasha had been fortifying Ramah, and King Asa used them to fortify Geba of Benjamin and Mizpah. The rest of the history of Asa, all his valor, his entire career, is this not recorded in the book of the annals of the kings of Judah? In his old age, however, he contracted a disease of his feet. When Asa fell asleep with his ancestors, he was buried with his ancestors in the city of his ancestor David. His son Jehoshaphat succeeded him. The reign of Nadab in Israel, 910 to 909. Nadab, son of Jeroboam, became king of Israel in the 2nd year of Asa, king of Judah, and he reigned over Israel for 2 years. He did what is displeasing to Yahweh. He copied his father's example and the sin into which he led Israel. Baasha, son of Ahijah, of the house of Issachar, plotted against him and murdered him at Gibbethon, a Philistine town which Nadab and all Israel were besieging. Baasha killed Nadab and succeeded him in the 3rd year of Asa, king of Judah. No sooner was he king than he butchered the entire house of Jeroboam, not sparing a soul, and put an end to it, just as Yahweh had foretold through his servant Ahijah of Shiloh, because the sins which he had committed, and into which he had led Israel, and because he had provoked the anger of Yahweh, God of Israel. The rest of the history of Nadab, his entire career, is this not recorded in the book of the annals of the Kings of Israel? We have a couple of more sections that we're going to read, and that would finish section 4. The reign of Baasha in Israel, 909 to 886. In the 3rd year of Asa, king of Judah, Baasha, son of Ahijah, became king of Israel at Tirzah for 24 years. He did what is displeasing to Yahweh. He copied the example of Jeroboam and the sin into which he had led Israel. The word of Yahweh came to Jehu, son of Hananiah, against Baasha. I raised you from the dust and made you leader of my people Israel. And you have followed Jeroboam's example, and led my people Israel into sin, which provoked my anger. Now I shall sweep away Baasha and his house. I shall make your house like the house of Jeroboam, son of Nebat. Those of Baasha's family who die in the city, the dogs will eat, and those who die in the open country, the birds of the air will eat. The rest of the history of Baasha, his career, his valor, is not recorded in the book of Annals of the Kings. Is it not? Sorry. Is this not recorded in the book of the Annals of the Kings of Israel? When Baasha fell asleep with his ancestors, he was buried in Tirzah. His son Elah succeeded him. Furthermore, the word of Yahweh was delivered through the prophet Jehu, son of Hananiah, against Baasha and his house, first because of the many ways in which he had displeased Yahweh, provoking him to anger by his actions, and becoming like the house of Jeroboam. Secondly, because he had destroyed that house. The reign of Elah in Israel, 886 to 885. In the 26th year of Asa, king of Judah, Elah, son of Baasha, became king of Israel at Tirzah for 2 years. Zimri, one of his officers, captain of half his charity. Oh, I think the guys that drove the chariots plotted against him. While he was at Tisra, drinking himself senseless in the house of Arza, who was master of the palace in Tirzah, Zimri came in, struck him down, and killed him in the 27th year of Asa, king of Judah, and succeeded him. On his ascension, as soon as he was seated on the throne, he butchered Baasha's entire family, not leaving him one man-jack of them alive, neither relative nor friend. Zimri destroyed the whole house of Baasha, in accordance with the word that which Yahweh had spoken against Baasha through the prophet Jehu, because of all the sins of Baasha and his son Elah, into which they had led Israel, provoking the anger of Yahweh, God of Israel, with their worthless idols. The history of Elah, his entire career, is this not recorded in the book of the Annals of the King of Israel? The reign of Zimri in Israel, 885. In the 27th year of Asa, king of Judah, Zimri became king for 7 days at Tirzah. The people were then encamped in front of Gibbethon, a Philistine town. When news reached the camp of how Zimri had not only plotted against but actually killed the king, all Israel proclaimed the army commander Omri as king of Israel in the camp that very day. Omri and all Israel with him laid the siege of Gibbethon and laid siege to Tirzah. When Zimri saw that the town had been captured, he went into the keep of the royal palace, burned the palace over his own head, and died. This was because of the sin which he had committed in doing what is displeasing to Yahweh, by copying the example of Jeroboam and the sin into which he had led Israel. The rest of the story of Zimri and of his conspiracy, is this not recorded in the book of the Annals of the Kings of Israel? The people of Israel then split into 2 factions, one half knowing Tibni, son of Ginath, to make him king, the other half following Omri. But the faction of Omri proved stronger than that of Tibni, son of Ginath. Thus Tibni lost his life and Omri became king. The reign of Omri in Israel, 885 to 874. In the 31st year of Asa, king of Judah, Omri became king of Israel and reigned for 12 years. He reigned for 6 years at Tirzah. Then for 2 talents of silver he bought the hill of Samaria from Shemer, and on it built a town which he named Samaria, after Shema, which had owned the hill. Omri did what is displeasing to Yahweh, and was worse than all his predecessors. In every way he copied the example of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, and the sins into which he had led Israel, provoking the anger of Yahweh, God of Israel, with all their worthless idols. The rest of the history of Omri, his career, his valor, is this not recorded in the book of the Annals of the Kings of Israel? When Omri fell asleep with his ancestors, he was buried in Samaria. His son Ahab succeeded him. Introduction to the reign of Ahab, 874 to 853. Ahab, son of Omri, became king of Israel in the 38th year of Asa, king of Judah, and reigned over Israel for 22 years in Samaria. Ahab, son of Omri, did what is displeasing to Yahweh, and worse than all his predecessors. The least that he did was to follow the sinful example of Jeroboam, son of Nebat. He married Jezebel, daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians, and then proceeded to serve Baal and worship him. He erected an altar to him in the temple of Baal, which he built in Samaria. Ahab also put up a sacred pole and committed other crimes as well, provoking the anger of Yahweh, God of Israel, more than all the kings of Israel, his predecessors. It was in his time that Hiel of Bethel rebuilt Jericho. Laying its foundations cost him his eldest son, Abiram, and erecting its gates cost him his youngest son, Segub, just as Yahweh had foretold through Joshua, his son of Nun. And that concludes that portion, section 4. And God willing, tomorrow we will start on section 5, the Elijah cycle. And as always, I love you.